Even in translation, the reader or the hearer is overwhelmed by the sublime prose that verges on poetry. As the account moves from the opening summary, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," through a series of literary panels or paragraphs, toward the conclusion which echoes the note struck in the first sentence, "Thus the heavens and the earth in their whole array were completed." Not only does this passage form an aesthetic literary whole, in which the conclusion harks back to the beginning in the manner of inclusion, but the creative drama takes place in two major dramatic movements, each one covering 3 days, and each following the descending pattern, heaven, waters, and earth. At the end of the first 3-day sequence, the narrator concentrates on the fertility of the earth in 2 aspects. First, the pushing back of the primeval watery chaos so that the dry land may appear. And second, the greening of the earth with vegetation. At the end of the second sequence of 3 days, the narrator focuses on human fertility and dominion over earth, again in 2 phases. First, the creation of life on earth, nefesh hayah, living beings. And second, the creation of the supreme earth being, Adam, which is to be translated as humankind, consisting of zakar unekeva, male and female. These beings being created in the image of God, in the imago Dei, and therefore who are to have dominion over God's earthly estate. Now, there are points of contact between this marvelous dramatic account and scientific interests, scientific study of nature, as I want to show in due course. But let me say at the outset, as a theologian, that we do an injustice to the creation story when we try to show that the sequence of creative events in their twofold movement, which I have just outlined, harmonizes with science. This is not the place to consider rationalizations of various matters. For instance, the creation of the sun on the 4th day, after vegetation on the 3rd day. Vegetation which, of course, is dependent on sunlight. Suffice it to say that the creation story was not written to present a scientific order of events or a classification of natural phenomena, but primarily to express faith in God. The story is presented as a drama of creation, in which various features of literary movement and style appeal to the poet within us and seek to awaken our faith in God the Creator. Jastrow, in his celebrated essay, says that the reason various scientists, including Einstein, and at Princeton our house is just diagonally across from where he used to live, Einstein reacted at first with irritation and vexation to the new astronomy. And the reason is that these startling vistas disturbed scientific faith in the efficacy of science, that is, scientific reason and method. Once in 1921, so Jastrow relates in this article, when Einstein visited New York City, a rabbi sent him a telegram with the question, "Do you believe in God?" That must have given palpitations of heart to the telegraph operator. "Do you believe in God?" And Einstein answered the rabbi saying these words, "I believe in Spinoza's God," not the God who is creator. The God who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists. Now, if modern scientific discoveries seem to bring us closer to the biblical creation story, we must remember that in the Bible, the affirmation that God is creator is a statement of faith. This faith, however, is not grounded primarily in scientific reason or technology. Rather, it is grounded in a story or history, which for those who were captivated by the story and drawn into it as participants, enabled them to know their identity as a people and the identity of the God who was dealing with them. In the beginning was the story. You remember that was the thesis of the first lecture. In the beginning was the story, not a doctrine of creation. Indeed, the Bible in its present form is deceptive by beginning with creation. The real opening of the biblical story is found in the book of Exodus, which tells the story of liberation from bondage, an event which disclosed the liberating, the saving power of God, known and worshipped by Israelites under the personal name Yahweh. The book of Genesis, which includes the history of the ancestors, Genesis 12 through 50, and before that the primeval history of origins, Genesis 1 through 11, is a dramatic preface that sets in universal and cosmic perspective the meaning of life and the divine purpose disclosed to a particular community, Israel, in its historical experiences. The experience of God as liberator, as Savior, is basic to the testimony that God is Creator. Just as, to speak Christianly, the first article of the Creed, namely, I believe in God the Father Almighty, is dependent upon the second. Confessionally, the people say, the God who has liberated us from bondage is none other than the Creator of the ends of the earth. So, you see, the biblical language concerning God as Creator belongs primarily to the realm of worship, as the liturgical prose of the first chapter of Genesis suggests. And worship is evoked not by theoretical reflection on the origin of the universe in a big bang flash of light, or on wisdom's reflection on the orderliness of the cosmos, but instead on what Professor Emil Fackenheim of the University of Toronto calls root experiences, or epoch-making events, in which God was wonderfully present to a people in their historical experience. I refer, of course, to Emil Fackenheim's important little book called God's Presence in History, Jewish Affirmations and Philosophical Reflections. So tonight, let us consider the theological meaning of the affirmation of faith. I, or we, believe in God, Creator of heaven and earth. I submit to you that creation faith has two dimensions. The first dimension is that of dependence. The world and all creatures in it are radically dependent on the Creator. This aspect of creation as dependence, receives emphasis in the beautiful creation Psalm 104. As a matter of fact, I think that that is the proper place for all of us to begin to understand anew the biblical doctrine of creation. One cannot be sure, but it may well be that this psalm is older than the Genesis creation story in the history of tradition, at least the final form of the priestly creation account. In any case, Psalm 104 follows essentially the same sequence as we find in the first chapter of Genesis, and like the Genesis account, it portrays the marvelous order of the created world. Notice that this psalm is a prayer of praise. The prayer begins and it ends with an invocation to the psalmist's self, to the psalmist's nephesh, or being, to adore, that is, to bless Yahweh. Bless Yahweh, O my being. And in this respect, there is very close agreement with the first chapter of Genesis, which is also doxological. That is, it is composed as a liturgy of praise to the Creator. What strikes me most about Psalm 104 is that this poem, in contrast to the first chapter of Genesis, is one in which the poetic artist is much freer to use mythical, or I should say mythopoeic, language. Notice, the psalmist begins by portraying Yahweh's heavenly kingship, Yahweh's heavenly enthronement. The Creator King, we read, clothes himself with light as with a garment. His celestial palace is provided with the broad canopy of the heavens, and its chambers are securely established upon beams which reach down into the primordial waters. And as a divine warrior, he rides on a chariot of clouds, borne on the wings of the wind. This is surely exquisite poetry. In the next stanza, we learn that the waters upon which the heavenly palace is founded reflect the old creation myth in a very small or faint degree. The earth, too, we read, is firmly established in the midst of the waters. But the waters appear to be unruly. They appear to be hostile, threatening. They are powers of chaos, which the Creator has to rebuke. That's the Hebrew verb, rebuke, chase back, limit, and hold within bounds. Listen to the poetic ascription to the Creator. This is a portion of the psalm which is in that kind of who formulation about which I spoke previously. Ascription to God who does this and that. So this ascription to Yahweh who establishes earth upon her foundations so that she is immovable forever. With Tehom, that's the Hebrew word which we should translate watery deep or watery abyss. With Tehom, you covered her like a garment. Above the mountains the waters stood. From your rebuke they fled. From your thundering voice they fled away. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place which you determined for them. A limit you fixed, which they are not to transgress, never again to cover the earth. It's impossible to appreciate this poetry, I maintain, at least to appreciate it fully, without knowing the old creation myth, found in the Babylonian creation myth, Enuma Elish, of how the Creator God entered into conflict with the hostile waters, the hostile powers of chaos, and created the earth by dividing them, separating them, pushing them back to an assigned place, and holding them in place, lest they seek to overpass their boundaries and once again overwhelm the earth, as it was in the beginning, and as almost happened according to the priestly version of the flood story. The world of God's creation, you see, in this mythopoeic language, is surrounded by, it is threatened by the powers of chaos. Indeed, the earth could revert to chaos were it not for the power of the Creator who creates order and upholds it. This poet in Psalm 104 continues in verses 10 through 13, continues the ascription of praise to the Creator by saying that Yahweh is the one who makes springs to break forth, thereby taming the waters of chaos, so that they give drink to animals and lave the earth with rain. Later on we hear that the sea, great and vast, is not threatening any longer, for it teems with marine life. Ships ply their course through it. And the mythical monster of chaos, Leviathan, is only a zoological monster that Yahweh formed to sport in it. That reminds you somewhat of the motif in Melville's Moby Dick. This is a world, a beautiful world, in which the Creator is in complete control. It's therefore an orderly world, in which every creature has its proper place and time, We read in this psalm that the stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for wild goats. The moon marks the seasons, and the sun knows its time for setting. When darkness comes at the will of the Creator, the wild beasts roam about through the night. And then the sun rises, and the beasts retreat to their hideouts. And Adam, humanity, human being, goes out to work and to labor until the evening. The poet exclaims praise to the Creator for the wonderful diversity of the creation, and for the way that he has made all things and all beings in chokhmah, in wisdom. The high point of the poem, Psalm 104, is reached toward the end in a passage which is very difficult to translate into English because of the problem of Hebrew tenses. The verbs in this passage, the Hebrew verbs in this passage, are so-called Hebrew imperfects, which indicate action that is incomplete, continuing, frequentive. We have to render these Hebrew verbs into our language by using the English present, which is often used for actions that are repeated. Let me try a translation. All of them, that is, earth's creatures, look to you to give them their food in its season. When you give to them, they gather up. When you open your hand, they are satisfied to the full. When you hide your face, they are disturbed. When you take away their breath, they expire and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, ruach, they are created. Perhaps we should say recreated again and again. And you renew again and again, you see, the surface of the soil. In this psalm, then, the emphasis falls upon creatio continua, continual creation, upon the Creator's power to hold the world in being in the face of the potential threats of chaos. Contrary to the ancient Greek philosophical view of the cosmos, the order of being is not a self-existent whole, which is perpetuated through its own internally operating dynamic. On the contrary, the world is radically dependent on God, the Creator. And if for just a moment he were to hide his face, or to withdraw his ruach, his spirit, to use the psalmist's poetic language, then everything, every being would languish and collapse or fall back into the original chaos from which it emerged. Well, insofar as the poet within us responds to the poet who composed this beautiful prayer of praise, the mythopoeic language about the threat of chaos enriches our appreciation of creation faith. This mythical language portrays our existence in the world. We are contingent beings, dependent daily and even moment by moment upon the Creator's sustaining and renewing and recreating power. Creation in this dimension is not so much an event of the past as a continuing activity. A continuing activity, as the verb bara, create, in the Hebrew imperfect indicates in this psalm. One can say with Martin Luther's shorter catechism that to believe in God as Creator means that God has created me, and that I am dependent on God's grace for life, for health, and for strength. And what is true for me as a dependent being is also true for the whole worshiping community of which I'm a part, as we confess in Psalm Old 100, know that Yahweh is God. It is He that made us, and we belong to Him. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture. And what is true for me and for us is also true derivatively for all creatures, animate and inanimate. The earth and all that is in it belongs to Yahweh the Creator, as we read at the very beginning of Psalm 24, and hence is radically dependent upon the Creator for existence. To Yahweh belongs the earth and everything in it, Psalm 24:1, the world and those who inhabit it. And then comes the motivation for this affirmation of faith, stated in mythopoeic language. Have you noticed that? For he has established it upon the seas and founded it upon the floods. That is, the waters of chaos. We turn now to a second dimension of the creation faith, creation as origination. This leads us from Psalm 104 to the closely related priestly account of creation found at the very beginning of our Bible. This is the classical story of creation, the one that Paul presupposes in his ascription of praise to God who commanded light to shine out of darkness and who has shone in our hearts through Jesus Christ. And there is some relation between the Genesis creation account and the prologue to the fourth gospel, which likewise is initiated with the words, in the beginning, en arche. In the priestly creation account, one can sense perhaps a very faint echo of the old creation myth. For in this case, too, creation occurs by separation, cleaving, separation of the waters above, the celestial waters, we are told, from the waters below, the deep that once covered the earth, by the interposition of a firmament, a rakia, on the second day. And on the third day, the narrator says, the terrestrial waters were gathered together and given their place with proper boundaries, so that the dry land might appear, perhaps a dim holdover of the mythopoeic view that the seas are remnants of the primeval waters of chaos. But these are only poetic touches. In the Genesis account, there is not the slightest suggestion that creation occurred in a conflict between the Creator and insurgent powers of chaos, even though we may be reminded in the Genesis account that chaos, the opposite of creation, lies out there at the edge of creation, so to speak, yet completely subject to the Creator's word that calls things into existence and assigns each creature its proper place and function in the sublime and ordered whole. So the myth of the conflict with Tiamat, that word, the Akkadian word Tiamat, Tiamatu, by the way, is very closely related to the Hebrew word Tahom, which is usually translated deep. So the myth of the conflict with Tiamat helps us only in that it performs a heuristic function. That is, it provides a stark contrast with the Genesis account and therefore highlights features of the biblical doctrine of creation which we might otherwise overlook, such as the view that the opposite of creation is chaos, not nothingness. The opposite of creation is chaos, tohu wavohu, and the notion that God created the earth out of chaos. Chaos, however, is portrayed in poetic language, watery abyss, Stygian darkness, a dynamic wind, a ruach Elohim stirring the waters. We should be very hesitant to translate this language, this very poetic language, into scientific terms. For instance, to identify chaos with matter. For the language here that has mythical overtones of meaning is intended to appeal to our religious and our poetic imagination. This story, which has pushed the creation myths of the ancient world far into the background, is, I maintain, a distinctive and unique theological witness for which there is no real theological parallel in antiquity. This narrator, for instance, displays a lively interest in the vast diversity within the Creator's order. And in language that shows some affinity with scientific interest, he shows that vegetation is differentiated according to species, Hebrew mean, often translated kind. Plants and trees reproduce according to their kind, their species, some yielding seed, and others bearing fruit that contains its seed. And the same is true of the innumerable living beings in the waters and the animals on the earth. They have the power to reproduce according to their species, according to their kind. Even when we say that this is a poetic, liturgical drama, not a scientific account of the origin of the earth and its creatures, we should not draw the line too sharply between religion and science. The big question is whether the creation account daringly pushes beyond mythopoeic language and even beyond our conceptual thinking, and dares to speak of the absolute beginning of the earth and the universe. In the beginning, God. The medieval Jewish scholar Rashi suggested that grammatically the first sentence in the book of Genesis is not an independent sentence, but is a dependent clause which, along with verse 2, leads up to the main sentence in verse 3, then God said, let there be light. Genesis 1, verse 1, then, is not an independent sentence, as we are used to translating it perhaps, but it is part of a circumstantial clause which leads up to the main verb of creation in chapter 3. Another medieval Jewish scholar, Ibn Ezra, agreed with this grammatical opinion, but maintained that verse 2 is the main sentence. Verse 1 is still a circumstantial clause, but it points up to the main sentence which begins in verse 2. You perhaps have noticed that in recent times this view has been supported by a number of translators, not only on the basis of a grammatical argument, and I cannot go into the mysteries of Hebrew grammar at this point, but by an appeal to other creation texts of antiquity which open with a circumstantial clause, as the famous Babylonian creation story, Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish literally means when above, and it's the beginning of a long circumstantial clause which, after some sentences, reaches the main verb. Or the old epic of creation and fall, the so-called Yahwist account found in Genesis 2 and 3 is also cited in support of this view, for this account begins similarly. In Genesis 2, verse 4b through 7, we read, in the day that Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and so forth. Then comes the main verb later on. Yahweh God formed Adam, humankind, of dust from the ground. Accordingly, the New English Bible translates in this manner: when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And the main verb comes later. And so does the New American Bible, the Roman Catholic translation. The effect of this translation is to soften or even to finesse the emphasis on absolute temporal beginning suggested in the word reshith, beginning, and to throw the emphasis, you see, on the creative process. Some scholars, like Klaus Westermann, who approaches the Genesis account from the angle of the phenomenology of human consciousness as expressed in myths found all over the world, maintains that the intention of the narrator is not to point to an absolute beginning of the world in time and space. But this view, I believe, is very doubtful. Stylistic study of the priestly creation story provides strong reason, at least according to my research, to believe that the formulaic expression in verse 3, then God said, Vayomer Elohim in the Hebrew, introduces a separate and discrete creation event. It's not to be hooked on to verses that precede it, but it represents a discrete and separate beginning, Vayomer Elohim, as we find at the introduction of other panels or paragraphs in the creation account. Some support for this translation of the first verse of Genesis as a discrete and separate sentence is found in the oldest translation of the Old Testament we have, the Greek translation, the so-called Septuagint, which was translated about 250 B.C. And the opening verses of the book of Genesis, according to this translation, read unequivocally, in arche epoiesin ho theos ton huranon kai ten gain. That is, in the beginning, God made the heaven and the earth. And this interpretation is also followed by the Revised Standard Version and by the Jerusalem Bible. So, the creation story, if we follow this exegetical interpretation, takes us back imaginatively to the absolute beginning, Reshith, to the cosmic flash of light released at the Creator's command. Let there be light. The first verse of Genesis, then, is an introduction to the whole account. The second verse is a preface to what immediately follows. The first main act of creation being, let there be light. The biblical doctrine of creation cannot, then, and should not be reduced to existential, creaturely dependence upon the Creator. Nor should it be historicized to mean the new things that God does ever and again in the historical process, as though we were to speak only of creation that continues. A proper exposition of biblical faith must give priority to creation as origination. All things and all beings are dependent upon God the Creator precisely because they originated in the Creator's sovereign will. And people may hope for new things, for new saving events in history, even for a new creation, precisely because the God whom they worship is the Creator of heaven and earth. Hence, the psalmist declares in the 33rd Psalm, using very poetic language, by the word of Yahweh the heavens were made. Psalm 33, verses 6 and 7. By the word of Yahweh the heavens were made, and all their host by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea in a bottle. He put the deeps in a storehouse. Again, the mythopoeic language. This faith in the great originator provides the basis for the confidence expressed in the following verses of Psalm 73, that Yahweh is the Lord of history, who frustrates the plans of people, who ignores the military preparations of nations, and who opens up a pathway into the future in his own manner. Similarly, in the great prophecy of the coming of God's kingdom, the advent of God the King is found in the poetry of so-called Second Isaiah, Isaiah 40 through 55. It's clear that Israel's hope for Yahweh's advent as king with saving power, her expectation of new things which will outshine anything known before, is grounded solidly in the conviction that the God whom Israel worships is the Creator, the one who was at the beginning as he will be at the end, the one who is the Creator of the ends of the earth, as the prophet puts it, and the one who calls out all the stars by their name. This cosmological horizon, grounded in Yahweh's wisdom and power as Creator, touches the historical existence of the people with comfort in a time of distress. For precisely because Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the Creator of the ends of the earth, those who wait for the coming of Yahweh and of his kingdom will not wait in vain. Indeed, we read at the very end of the 40th chapter of Isaiah, those who wait for Yahweh shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So we come in a full circle back to where we started in this lecture, to the question posed by Jastrow in his flamboyant essay in the New York Times Magazine. The question is whether the latest scientific discovery that the universe originated in a cosmic explosion, a Big Bang, coincides with the biblical view of creation. And this question tantalizes us further with the larger question of the relation between science and religious faith. On the surface, it seems as though the modern astronomical theory is similar to the biblical view of creation insofar as it points to an absolute beginning of the universe in time. It would be difficult to square the biblical doctrine of creation with the view that the cosmos is an eternally existing system of being, and that within this structure, as the Greeks put it, God is the acme of being. No, in the biblical view, God is not the summit or the acme of being, but the one who as creator transcends the whole realm of being. God is above being, prior to being, before being, the creator of all being. Accordingly, the cosmos is not eternal and self-existence according to its own laws. The universe in which we live and move and have our being had an origin in the Creator's will and purpose at a sharply defined moment, even as it will have an end. So there is similarity. On the other hand, it is erroneous to suppose that modern scientific discoveries somehow prove the biblical doctrine of creation. Agnostics cannot be coerced by science into believing, and believers surely cannot relax in the confidence that science supports their faith. Even if the universe originated in a cosmic explosion, like the flash of a hydrogen bomb on a vast scale, this originating event does not necessarily bring us into the context of biblical faith. Divine purpose is not proven, nor is it disproven, by the view that the universe originated in a single Big Bang in the beginning. And an expanding universe, which originated from such a gigantic explosion, is not necessarily a meaningful universe that provides a home of divine concern and care. The cosmos may provide hints of divine purpose. It may display the glory of the Creator as we read in Psalm 19. But in the last analysis, there can be no escape from the decision of faith and from the posture of worship in the community. Jastrow whimsically suggests that scientists, after valiant struggle for a breakthrough, arrive at a vantage point only to discover that theologians have been there for a long time. It's more accurate, I believe, to say that scientists and theologians, despite their differences, stand on common ground as they contemplate the overwhelming and impenetrable mystery of creation. The scientist surely knows that creation, insofar as it witnesses to origination, lies beyond the grasp of our most probing and sensitive instruments. The evidence of the first creative flash has been destroyed, as Jastrow remarks, and science, with its methodology, with its limited methodology, cannot prove the thesis that the universe originated in God's act of creation. So there is mystery. And the theologian surely knows that creation, insofar as it deals with origination, lies completely beyond our theological concepts. My colleague George Hendry, Professor Emeritus of Systematic Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, writes these words in an article on the eclipse of creation: all of our concepts depend on experience, and we have no experience of being created. Being created is the precondition of our experience, and hence of our concepts which are based upon experience. So the theologian, too, is brought face to face with mystery. Whether scientists or theologians, our methods and our concepts then bring us to the very boundary of thought, where we are confronted with the ultimate mystery. No evidence survives from the primal event. No human witness was there. Hence, like Job, we are addressed by the voice out of the mysterious whirlwind. Do you remember that marvelous passage there at the beginning of the 38th chapter of Job? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Notice the mythopoeic language. On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. In conclusion, there are two things that fill me with awe as I read the dramatic creation story in the book of Genesis. The first is the shocking wonder that things are rather than are not. The mystery, the wonder, the ontological shock of that realization that I am, you are, things are, rather than are not. And that, as Samuel Taylor Coleridge said, we are parts and proportions of one marvelous whole. The second wonder exceeds the first, if that is possible. It's the wonder that the Creator of this vast and marvelous cosmos cares for and is concerned about human beings. He created humankind to a position of honor and responsibility, crowning us as kings and queens in his far-flung earthly estate. A psalmist who must have known the creation story in the first chapter of Genesis was overwhelmed with this wonder as he looked up into the star-studded night sky. You remember that beautiful poem, Psalm 8? When I look up at thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars set in their place by thee. What is man? What is humanity, that thou shouldst remember him? Mortal man, that thou shouldst care for him. Yet thou hast made him little less than a god, crowning him with glory and honor. Thou makest him master over all thy creatures. Thou hast put everything under his feet. Imagine it. The Creator of this far-flung cosmos, whose immensities continue to baffle us as we send our instruments of exploration out into space, that this Creator should not only care for and be concerned about this small planet and these small human beings on this planet, but that he should crown them as kings and queens. This coronation of human beings not only endows us with privilege and with divine grace, but it endows us with responsibility to be the stewards of God's marvelous estate, to administer affairs on earth with benevolence and justice, and to gain knowledge, such as in this university, and to use its benefits with wisdom. In short, we are called upon to be God's representatives on earth. Representatives on earth. And that, I submit to you, is what it means to be made in the image of God.